that the market be perfectly competitive. And as best I can tell, that's a small subset of all markets. Now, of course, when we have this, we have the best of all possible outcomes. But if there are market failures, then we end up with a second best argument. And I know second best is an oxymoron, right? So, but the second best argument essentially says, look, if we've got a market failure that moves us away from our first best solution, there is a role for the government to play in basically offsetting that market failure. It may be that the government policy should affect that market failure directly, or it may be that the government policy could affect that market failure indirectly. We'll see in just a minute that more direct approaches are typically better. But this would give us a valid reason for a government trade policy. Now, market failures come about from, the broad sense of market failures, come about from private market failures, where the market itself does not achieve economic efficiency. This will typically occur when one of two events is taking place. Either we have externalities, either positive or negative externalities, or when we have market power, so that a firm can decide, basically is a price setter rather than a price taker. So that's where market failures can come about. Now, of course, government policies also create market failures in the sense that the price may not equal the marginal benefits or the marginal costs, either private or social. So taxing and spending, or taxes and subsidies will prevent that problem. So here's a couple of externalities. One, when the marginal social costs are greater than the price. So notice here, we're assuming that the price reflects the private costs. So these two are equal, but the private costs essentially are less than the social cost. In this case, we would get too much being supplied. And an example of this is a production process that generates lots of pollution. If the firm does not have to account for the pollution that it's generating, that's a cost to society that is not incorporated in the private cost of the company. So the total cost to society, the private cost plus the social cost, will be out of whack, and we'll get too much production of that particular good. Of course, we can also have private benefits, social private benefits greater than the price. And here, notice that our social marginal benefits are also greater than the private benefits. Again, another externality, but in this case, from a society's point of view, or the economy's overall efficiency allocation of resources, too little is demanded. Too little is demanded. So a great example here happens to be education. It turns out that a well-educated population creates benefits not only for the individual, but also for society at large. And so if those social benefits, social marginal benefits, are greater than the price, then society is, the benefits to society would be very large, but because you're paying the price for your individual benefits, we wouldn't have enough people actually going to school. So this is, again, an example where we could have differences between social benefits in cost and private benefits in cost. Now, the other market type failure is market power. And so whenever the price is above the marginal social cost, we actually end up with monopoly power. Right? And so we already know that in a perfectly competitive environment, right, the price will equal the marginal cost. Right? Remember, in a perfectly competitive environment, the price is equal to the demand curve, which is equal to the marginal revenue curve. So the price will equal the marginal cost. But in this particular case, even if the social marginal cost is equal to the private marginal cost, price will be higher. It's got a downward sloping demand curve and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So the profit maximizing firm is actually going to charge too high a price and produce too low a quantity relative to an efficient, perfectly competitive market environment. We can have the opposite situation as well, which is something known as monopsony power, where we only have a single buyer or a limited number of buyers, in which case not enough of the product is actually being supplied to the marketplace. And then in terms of government distortions, if we have a tax, it is going to take, even when the price equals the social marginal cost, once we add the tax, it raises it above. And so now we've got a distortion and not enough is being supplied. The price is being risen, the quantity demanded will be less, and the firm will also supply less as well. We have just the opposite with a subsidy. When you have a distorting subsidy, too much is supplied. Now, what we're going to focus on in terms of these types of market failures is primarily on externalities rather than on government distortions or market power itself. So let's talk just a little bit about the theory of the second best. So the theory of the second best essentially says, okay, we've got a market failure somewhere. Regardless of what the reason is, we know we have a market failure. So we don't have private marginal cost and social marginal cost equalized, or private marginal benefits and social marginal benefits equalized. So we've got that market failure. We'd like to have a more efficient allocation of resources. So this says that the government, as the agent of society, should be able to enact a policy to try to get us closer to a first best solution. Now, that government policy may be directly aimed at the market failure itself, or it may be aimed at a second market that will have an influence on the first market where the failure is taking place. Most trade policies actually fall into that second category, indirect government actions attempting to influence a market failure in the first market. And again, we'll have some examples of that a little bit later. There are essentially two approaches for fixing market distortions. One is use tax and subsidies. This is the government approach. The other is a property rights approach, which we're not going to talk about. It's very interesting, but you should take public finance or managerial economics or public policy, all that kind of good stuff. But most of trade policy is either a tax or a subsidy approach, which is why we're going to focus on that first one. Okay, so market failures complicate the task of judging whether a trade barrier is good or bad, right? So we know that in a free market situation, the trade barriers reduce economic efficiencies. But once you introduce externalities into it, we then need to also be able to account for the effect of those externalities, whether they are benefits or whether there are additional costs. And that means that now you almost have to look at each situation rather than being able to make blanket statements. That said, however, we can also think about the specificity rule. The specificity rule essentially says the best policy is the most direct policy. If there's a problem, if there's an externality, have a policy that hits that externality directly, rather than an indirect policy that may have, or policy that comes about it in an indirect way. So that's what the specificity rule means. So we want to act on a problem as directly as possible. And again, we'll see, excuse me, we'll see in just a minute exactly how that works out. Okay. Now, with this in mind, then we can start to look at a number of arguments that have made for trade protection. So we've already listed, 5 or 6 different reasons that we might want to have trade protection. Now we'll go through a bunch of arguments. So I just listed these 1 through, I think, 7. Okay. So the first argument is we must or need to maintain a high level of domestic production of a particular product for some reason, right? Now, we already know that if this is a product that we also import, that the exporting country can make this product more cheaply than we can. So we're trying to maintain a domestic industry larger than would happen under free trade, and therefore there must be some extra beneficial reason for having that larger industry. So that means that there must be some sort of important spillover or externality effects. There must be some positive externalities associated with larger domestic production. Now, the production might not be the actual argument. The argument might actually be that we need to maintain a high level of employment in that industry, or other resource uses, whether it's land or capital or any of the other resources that we might be using. So we're essentially talking about a situation where we have positive externalities. Now, in all the analysis that we're going to do here in terms of understanding this, we're going to take the small country case. Just because this way we don't have to move the world price, it's a little bit cleaner. You could do the same thing with a large country case. Maybe I'll use that on a problem set next semester. Notice I said next semester, so don't panic. Okay, so here's a situation, and let's suppose that. Well, one of the things that we can see is that, I don't know what these things are doing up here. So at the world price, you can see that the output that we're producing is down at S0. So we've got a relatively low level of domestic production. But the argument is we need this tariff because there's something special about higher levels of economic output in this industry. And so what we know here is that if we impose a tariff, what we also see is that we get an increase in output. Now, if we get an increase in the output for the industry, we're also getting an increase in resource usage in the industry. There'll be higher employment, there'll be more capital being used, there'll be more land being used, whatever other resources are actually being used in this industry. Now, we can go back to our welfare analysis. Oh, and notice, of course, that that tariff does, in fact, reduce the quantity demanded, and it also reduces the volume of imports. But if we look at just this part of our welfare analysis, we see that consumer surplus falls by the areas of A, B, C, and D, that producer surplus increases by area A, and that government revenue increases by area C. So on our standard welfare analysis, our net effect is that we are worse off as a small country by our production and consumption distortions. So we're worse off by our triangles, deadweight losses. Okay. Now remember, the reason we put this tariff on was not looking at these deadweight losses, but because we were assuming that there was some sort of externality in this industry. There was something extra beneficial about this increased output or this increased employment or other resource utilization in the industry. Well, we've got to be able to measure that extra benefit. So on the axes on the right, we see, okay, here's our original level of production. The tariff has managed to increase production to S1. So now what we'll have is a marginal external benefit curve that is downward sloping. So the higher and higher the output goes, we got more benefit, but it's going to get smaller and smaller as we get higher and higher levels of output. So notice that now this economy is gaining this area here. So let's call this G. Don't ask me why G. I know it doesn't come after D, but it's just another letter. So now all of a sudden we've got this marginal external benefit out here of G. So here we're sitting with our production and consumption distortions, definite losses to the economy, plus this marginal external benefit. So now what we can see is this tariff might actually increase national economic welfare, even in this small country, as long as G, the marginal external benefits, the capture of the positive externalities, is greater than the production and consumption distortions that take place. So that gives us then a way of thinking about why a tariff might not be such a terrible thing. Now, of course, what we have to be able to do is actually identify what these external benefits are. And we also need to be able to try and have some ballpark measurement of what they are. Notice that B and D, these production and consumption distortions, they can actually be measured. Right? We can estimate what the supply and the demand curves look like. We know what the world price is. We know what the tariff-ridden price is. So we can actually calculate some ballpark figures for production and consumption distortions. But do we really know exactly where this marginal external benefit curve lies? Could I have drawn it much higher or much lower? Well, of course. But how do we measure these because these are external benefits, what we mean by external is they're external to the marketplace. So there are no quantities associated with them, and there are no prices associated with them. So valuing these marginal external benefits is very difficult and also very subjective in most cases. That's not to say they don't exist, and it's not to say that they aren't substantial. They might very well be. It's only that it's really hard to be sure, in most cases, in the real world. So notice where this leaves us then. Even for a small importing country, we may have a gain or a loss. It depends upon the size of the marginal external benefit. Also notice that even if we do have a net positive, there's still a redistribution of income. Consumers, presumably, consumers are clearly paying a higher price and are worse off for that. Producers are clearly receiving a higher price and are clearly benefited from that. And so you've got these marginal external benefits that accrue to somebody or some group in society and in the economy, more likely to be communities or workers or owners of factors of production, and difficult to figure out exactly who they accrue to or how much they accrue to for each individual. Okay? So a tariff is one way of doing this in capturing these marginal external benefits. But remember the specificity rule? It said, if you've got a problem, why not attack it as directly as you can? As directly as you can. So let's think about a second way of attacking this issue. Now notice this is not PT, it's P sub S. So what we're going to do is provide a production subsidy. So if the argument is going to be there's something extra beneficial about increased production, why not subsidize production directly? So let's see what happens here. Now we're only going to subsidize the incremental production, right? So the subsidy is going to be the difference between P sub S and P sub W. And we are, of course, going to increase output from S0 to S1. So let's look at two things, A and B. So let's do change in consumer surplus. Now, one of the ways that we want to think about this is producers are being subsidized to increase their production, but they still have to compete against imports to sell their product. Because they still have to compete against imports, whose price has not changed inside the importing country, right? So consumers still get to buy imported goods at PW, the world price. So the domestic producers can't raise the price of domestically produced goods. Now, they're getting a subsidy for their extra production, but they can't raise the price. So notice consumers are still buying at the world price, which means that there's no change in consumer surplus. So this is a big goose egg. Now, producer surplus goes up. So consumers are receiving incremental revenue, the difference between the subsidized price and the world price, but only on their incremental production. So remember, it's always the change in prices above the supply curve. Now, we're not going to subsidize the firm for the units that they were already producing, so the producer surplus is only area A. Now, we also have a government revenue. Right? The government actually has to pay the subsidy. But the government has to pay the area of A and B. So when we think about the net effect here, what we see is it's only area B. It's a loss of area B. So the production subsidy eliminates the consumption distortion. It doesn't eliminate the production distortion. That's still there. Producers are still producing at a price that's different than the free market price. But also notice that by increasing production, we've also captured all of our marginal external benefit. So in this case, even though we have this production distortion, it's more likely that we're going to end up with an increase in national economic welfare because we've gotten rid of that consumption distortion. If there's something extra beneficial about increased output or increased resource utilization, why not subsidize it directly? Okay? Why not? What's the difference besides the consumption distortion between doing this production distortion and the tariff? Well, the question was we have to pick which firms to subsidize or which industries to subsidize, but we've got that problem in both cases, right? We've got to figure out what products to put the tariff on or which industry to subsidize. So, I mean, it is a question. Which industries do we do? How do we pick between them? There's no government revenue here, positive government revenue, right?